What if getting away with breaking the rules wasn't about being smarter, but simply about buying time? What if the system didn't fail to stop you, it just moved too slowly to catch you? And what happens when that delay disappears? Because what you're about to hear is not a normal political story, not a routine legal update, and definitely not just another courtroom headline about Donald Trump. This is not a normal hearing. This is not a debate. This is the moment a legal system that has been stretched, tested, and repeatedly delayed quietly changes the rules of the game. And it doesn't announce it loudly. It doesn't need to. It just prepares. The scene opens not in a courtroom explosion, but in something far more unsettling, a pattern that has already been written down, documented, and sealed into the record. 10 separate contempt findings. 10 times where a judge didn't speculate, didn't guess, but confirmed that Donald Trump violated a gag order deliberately, publicly, and repeatedly. Not one slip, not one misunderstanding, a pattern. And here's the part that matters. Those 10 violations are not just punishments, they are groundwork. Because when you hear $9,000 in fines, it sounds small, almost trivial, especially for someone with power, influence, and a political machine behind him. But that number is misleading. The money isn't the consequence, the documentation is. Each violation was logged, each statement matched against the order, each intent established. That's not punishment, that's construction. A legal structure being built piece by piece, where the next violation doesn't start from 0, it starts from 10. Now listen carefully to what was said, and more importantly, what wasn't. The judge didn't just issue fines. The judge issued a warning, clear, direct, on the record. Any further violation could lead to incarceration, up to 30 days per instance. That sentence exists. It's written. It's real. What was not said is just as important. There was no ambiguity, no suggestion that this would require a long, drawn-out process next time, no hint that the system would reset and start fresh. That silence, that omission, that's where the shift begins. Because normally, in a case like this, every violation would trigger a new cycle. Hearings, arguments, delays, weeks, sometimes months. A system that moves slowly enough for strategy to work, for pressure to fade, for narratives to change. But this time, that cycle has already been compressed. And then comes the second signal, quieter but far more powerful. The Supreme Court of the United States is presented with a chance to step in, to pause, to shield, to delay, and it declines. No dramatic statement, no political speech, just a decision not to interfere with Trump's sentencing process in New York. But in legal terms, that decision speaks louder than any ruling. It tells every lower court judge in the country something simple and dangerous: proceed. Treat this defendant like any other. No special buffer, no invisible protection, no expectation that a higher court will step in at the last second to stop enforcement. Now step back and look at the full picture. 10 documented violations, a written threat of jail time, a Supreme Court that refuses to intervene. This is no longer a situation where consequences are theoretical. This is a system aligning itself, quietly, precisely, and with intent, to close the gap between action and consequence. And if you think this is still about politics, you're missing what's actually happening. Because the real story isn't what Donald Trump said. It's what the system is now ready to do next. Because once you understand that shift, everything else starts to look different. Not louder, not more chaotic, but more controlled, more deliberate, and far less forgiving for Donald Trump. Let's move into prosecutorial mode, because this is where the narrative stops being abstract and starts becoming evidence. Dates matter, numbers matter, written orders matter, and right now the record is not vague, it's stacked. 10 contempt findings, each tied to a specific violation of a gag order issued during a criminal proceeding in New York. Each reviewed and confirmed by a judge, each accompanied by a financial penalty that reached the legal maximum, $9,000 total. That's not random. That's a ceiling being hit, deliberately, to establish that the court has already used its least severe tool. And when a court exhausts its lower-level penalties, it doesn't go backward. It escalates. Now look at the language that follows those findings. Not speculation, not commentary. Written warning. Future violations could result in incarceration, up to 30 days per violation. That is not symbolic language. That is pre-approved consequence. That is a judge placing the next step on the record before it happens. So when the next violation occurs, the court is not asking, "What should we do?" The court is asking, "Has the trigger been pulled?" That's a completely different legal posture. And here's the contradiction that exposes the entire defense strategy. For years, Donald Trump's legal approach has depended on one assumption: that time is always available, that every accusation opens a new process, that every process can be stretched, that every stretch creates space, space for appeals, space for political shifts, space for narrative control. But this structure removes that space. Because the argument has already been made, the evidence has already been reviewed, the behavior has already been classified, the consequence has already been defined. There is no reset button anymore. Now add the next layer of receipts, because this is where the system stops being theoretical and becomes operational. The New York City Department of Correction has acknowledged preparation, not speculation, not rumor, preparation. That means procedures are being reviewed, facilities are being considered, the logistical gap between a judicial order and physical enforcement is being closed. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to say out loud: systems do not prepare for outcomes they consider impossible. They prepare for outcomes they consider likely enough to justify action. So now we have legal groundwork and operational readiness moving in the same direction. And that's when the logic pressure becomes unavoidable. If 10 violations are already documented, if the judge has already issued a jail warning, if the Supreme Court has already declined to intervene, if correctional authorities are already preparing, then what exactly is missing? Not evidence, not authority, not infrastructure. What's missing is only one thing: the next violation. And this is where the silence becomes louder than any statement. Because since that warning was issued, the pattern changed. The violations did not accelerate, they slowed, not publicly explained, not officially acknowledged, but observable, which tells you something critical. The system didn't need to act yet. It only needed to make it clear that it could. And for the first time, the cost of crossing that line is no longer theoretical, no longer delayed, and no longer negotiable. It is immediate. And once that becomes real, the entire game changes, not just for Donald Trump, but for everyone standing behind him, watching closely, and recalculating what loyalty actually costs when the clock is no longer on their side. And that recalculation is where this stops being a legal story and starts becoming a pressure test on loyalty, on risk, and on the limits of power itself around Donald Trump. Because up until this point, loyalty was cheap. You could stand beside him, echo his language, challenge the courts, push the boundaries, and the worst-case scenario looked manageable. A fine, a headline, maybe a hearing weeks later that could be delayed, reframed, diluted. But jail is different. Jail doesn't wait for messaging strategy. Jail doesn't respond to fundraising emails. Jail doesn't care about political optics. And suddenly the cost structure changes. Now think about the people inside that circle: advisors, officials, witnesses, people like Kash Patel, who have already been pulled into testimony under immunity. When immunity enters the equation, the legal math flips. The risk of telling the truth drops. The risk of lying skyrockets. That's not theory, that's leverage. And leverage is what this entire framework has been building toward. Because once the system signals that enforcement is real, not distant, not negotiable, it doesn't just constrain one defendant, it reshapes the behavior of everyone connected to the case. Every conversation becomes calculated. Every statement is weighed not just against political fallout, but against legal exposure that can no longer be postponed. Now, layer in the real-world consequences that exist outside the courtroom, because this is where the moral contrast sharpens. While this legal infrastructure is being built, people like Tracy Calvo, a 61-year-old voter, are living the downstream effects: fixed income, rising prices, fewer choices, less mobility, skipping community, skipping routine, watching the cost of everyday life climb while political narratives promise control that never quite arrives. And then comes the breaking point: a decision to escalate tensions with Iran. A move that transforms abstract policy into real fear, of conflict, of instability, of consequences that don't stay contained in speeches or rallies. For her, that wasn't strategy. That was risk entering daily life. So now place these two realities side by side. On one side, a system that is finally accelerating consequences for repeated violations of the law. On the other, ordinary people absorbing the consequences of decisions made far above them, with no delay, no buffer, no appeal. That's the contrast. That's the imbalance. And that's where the narrative shifts from legal mechanics to ethical weight. Because if a person with power can violate orders 10 times and still operate freely, while a citizen feels immediate consequences from economic pressure or geopolitical decisions, then the question isn't just about legality. It's about fairness. And here's where the logic tightens even further. The courts are not reacting emotionally, they are adapting structurally, they are closing the gap that delay strategies exploited, they are documenting behavior, predefining consequences, and preparing enforcement so that when action is required, it doesn't stall. That's not political. That's systemic correction. But systemic correction comes with a test. Because once a system proves it can act quickly, consistently, and without exception, it has to answer the one question it can't avoid. Will it apply that standard equally, even when the defendant is the most powerful figure in the room? And if the answer is yes, then the next violation is not just another entry in a legal record. It's a moment that defines whether the system enforces rules, or merely documents their violation. And that is where everything converges, law, power, consequence, into a single moment that no one can spin, delay, or reframe around Donald Trump. Because at this point, the facts are no longer in dispute. 10 violations have already been recorded. A judge has already warned of jail time, up to 30 days per violation. The Supreme Court of the United States has already declined to intervene. The New York City Department of Correction has already prepared for enforcement. Nothing here is hypothetical anymore. So strip away the commentary, strip away the noise, and ask the only question that actually matters. What happens when the next line is crossed? Because this is where the moral scene stops being abstract and becomes unavoidable. Picture it clearly, not as a headline, not as a talking point, but as a real-world image. A system that has documented, warned, escalated, and prepared, finally reaching the point where it must either act or admit that it won't. There is no middle ground left. If enforcement happens, it will not feel dramatic. It will feel procedural, fast, controlled, almost clinical. Because everything that needed to be argued has already been argued. Everything that needed to be proven has already been proven. The system will simply execute what it has already decided. But if enforcement does not happen, if another violation occurs and nothing follows, then the message is just as loud. It tells every observer, every ally, every critic, and every citizen watching that the rules can be written, repeated, and even enforced selectively, but not universally. And that's where the real damage begins. Because this was never just about Donald Trump. This was about whether the legal system in the United States can handle a defendant with enough influence to test its limits repeatedly without breaking its credibility. It was about whether documentation leads to consequence, or whether it simply becomes a historical record of ignored warnings. And the system has already moved further than most people realize. It has shortened timelines, it has reduced procedural delay, it has signaled independence from political pressure. It has done everything except the final step. And that final step is the one that defines everything that came before it. Because law without enforcement is suggestion, warning without consequence is theater, documentation without action is permission. So, when you hear people argue that this is just politics, that this is just another legal fight, that this will drag on like everything else, you're hearing a narrative that no longer fits the facts. The facts show acceleration. The facts show preparation. The facts show a system that is no longer waiting. And that brings us to the question that no campaign, no legal team, and no institution can avoid answering. If the next violation triggers immediate consequence, if the system acts within hours instead of months, if power no longer guarantees delay, then what exactly is left of the idea that some people operate above the rules? Is the law finally catching up to power? Or are we about to find out, once and for all, that it never could? If you followed this breakdown to the end, you already know this isn't about one case. It's about the line between authority and accountability, and whether that line actually holds when it's tested at the highest level. So now it's your turn. Do you think the system will act when that moment comes, or hesitate again? Drop your perspective in the comments, because this is the kind of question that defines more than a headline. And if you want more breakdowns like this, clear, precise, and focused on what actually matters, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.